The White House meeting comes less than a day after President Putin warned Western governments not to let Ukraine target Russia with Western arms, saying a move would drag the country supplying Kyiv into the war. Let's bring in Lord Kim Darroch, a former UK National Security Advisor and British Ambassador to the US, and Andrew Levi served as a senior diplomat in the UK's embassy in Moscow at the times of the Litvinenko murder. Good to speak to both of you. Kim, first of all, I think you were listening across to Sabrina there, talking about that, how she regards that special relationship. There's been comments under recent UK governments that that special relationship isn't what it used to be. What are your thoughts? How do you view that? Is it still important? Is it still there?
Yeah, it's still there because the bedrock, or one of the bedrocks of the relationship, is the defence, intelligence and security relationship. We are still the second biggest contributor to NATO. We have been alongside the Americans on interventions are out of fashion now, but in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya. And when they want someone to, as it were, go into dangerous territory with them, they usually look to us. So there is still a strong and special relationship. It is, to be frank, a bit diminished because we were once also the main channel into the EU. If the Americans wanted to influence decisions the EU were taking, they would come to us and say, can you help? We're not around that table anymore, but we're still permanent members of the Security Council. We still have our substantial military strength. And we still have a global foreign policy. So, yes, it still counts.
Interesting. And Andrew, Putin has said, we were saying there, that any use of missiles from the West by Ukraine against Russia would be seen as NATO participating in the war. Does he mean this? Is this serious?
On one hand, he's been saying this for at least 18 months, both directly and via his proxies. As the Polish foreign minister mentioned, there have been a series of supposed red lines. Do you remember heavy weaponry and tanks? And there were nuclear threats as a result. So on the one hand, it's more of the same. On the other hand, this is real, this is serious. We wouldn't be talking about these missiles and their capabilities if they didn't have serious potential impact on the battlefield, as it were. So I think what you quite likely will see, we don't know, is that Putin will ramp up what we call hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, assassinations, including with radiological and nerve agents, as we've experienced in the UK, sabotage, like an arms factory in Berlin being set on fire. And just examples of what's been going on. And I think there'll be more of that, quite possibly.
And Kim, President Biden obviously is going to give way to a new president in a few months. How do you think Keir Starmer and NATO will fare in negotiating with the two candidates, whichever one it is? How do you see that going?
First point to make is that Biden's still around, as you say, for a few months more. And there's enough trouble around the world, whether Ukraine war or the conflict in Gaza or the challenge from China, that Biden's leadership is still very relevant. And so let's not write him out of the story yet. But on the future, look, obviously, especially with the Labour government, if Kamala Harris wins, that ideological political alignment does help. And so life is going to be more straightforward, particularly since she seems largely committed to continuity with Biden's foreign policy. If it is Trump, then Trump, one, has said he will do a deal to end the war. But what he means by that is he will press Zelensky by denying him U.S. weapons to basically do a deal with Biden that would amount to, with Putin, that would amount to giving Putin all the territory he's won, at the least in eastern Ukraine, and perhaps more. So that would be, in my view, a major defeat for the West. We spent $200 billion supporting Ukraine, and we would have got nothing much for it. So it's going to be difficult if it's Trump, and that's not to mention his ideas on trade tariffs and his disdain for NATO. It'll be easier with Biden, but we will have to do our best to influence whoever is in the White House. So there's no point in praying for a particular outcome. We must deal with the cards as they fall on the table.
Indeed. And Andrew, how much longer can Ukraine sustain this war? And I suppose, secondary, how much longer can the West prop up Ukraine, do you think?
I don't particularly think I would frame it that way. I think both sides are under a lot of pressure. Russia is the bigger country, absolutely. I think Ukraine can win. Now, there's a big spectrum of definitions of what winning means, but I'll give you one example. If they're to come to the negotiating table, the question is from what position of strength or weakness? And negotiation doesn't have to be about territory. I mean, it could be, but that would already be a terrible and destabilizing defeat for everybody in the West. It can be about the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, but under what terms? It can involve demilitarized zones, all sorts of questions like that. The question of how far you get down that path towards that kind of resolution at the negotiating table, it depends on what's going on the battlefield in the military confrontation and how strong either side is.
And Kim, how do you see this war ending?
Look, I'm a bit of a pessimist on this, I'm sorry to say. I don't see the circumstances for any kind of deal arising soon unless we get a Trump presidency and he forces Zelensky into some kind of concession. I think that at the moment, at least in the battle in eastern Ukraine, the Russians have a slight advantage and they're making a bit of territory day by day, but with something like 1,200 casualties a day, which is a really serious toll that it's taking on them. Meanwhile, Ukraine, I think, has done well in the sort of war at sea, and it has launched this incursion into Russia, which so far has been quite successful. Though I think they're not going to be able to hold that land forever. So, barring a Trump victory and a forced concession by Ukraine, I think this war can go on for into 2025, maybe even to 2026, because I don't see Putin. He will keep going until it is done in his eyes, and I think the Ukrainians are defending their homeland, and they're not going to give up easily. So I just fear potentially a long-running war of attrition.
And Andrew, just finally, briefly, do you share Kim's, I suppose he said himself, pessimism about that?
Well, I certainly think his analysis is perfectly credible. That it could drag on. I suppose if it's pessimism, optimism, I'll be slightly more optimistic, in that I think with a Harris presidency, with a Harris victory and the presidential election behind them, there are always midterms to come up in the US, but the US administration will feel freer. If it comes to that, and it's not a Trump presidency, they'll feel freer to take more decisive action, not just backing allies who want to use missiles with American components in, but perhaps also helping more directly with such missiles and deep strikes, and force Putin into an untenable position. But it's very, very unclear what will happen. I think that's the main point. Whether one's pessimistic or optimistic, there's no, the future is unknowable, but this is particularly tricky to forecast.
Fascinating speaking to both of you. Thank you so much for your time, Lord Kim Darroch there and Andrew Levy. Now it's time for